Hey, this is Mark Goldberg with the UN Affairs blog, UN Dispatch.
And this is Matthew Lee from InnerCityPress.com, speaking to you from the UN.
So Matthew, happy World Malaria Day. So this is Friday, April 25th, and it's the first ever World Malaria Day. As you celebrating?
I've been in a malaria frenzy all week. We've had a series of briefings by David Stern of the NBA was here, as well as the head of both Methodists and Lutherans, I believe. And today we had the new envoy of Ban Ki-moon's envoy for malaria, Ray Chambers, financier, philanthropist, and general man about Newark. So it's been
Well, now, in case viewers are wondering why David Stern of the NBA, the commissioner of the NBA, would be at the UN to promote this, the NBA, in concert with the UN Foundation and the Methodist Church, among other, and Sports Illustrated, among other organizations, started this group called Nothing But Nets that seeks to raise anti-malarial bed nets and send them to sort of malaria-affected communities in sub-Saharan Africa. Actually, we'll put up a link to this because I think it's a really cool organization.
Sure. In full disclosure, it is the UN Foundation supported.
It is a UN Foundation. Yes, it's a UN Foundation supported and sort of housed. Like UN Foundation, I think absorbs all the overhead costs of running it. But what it is it's kind of a movement. You donate $10 and they'll send a bed net that's treated with anti-malarial sort of insecticide, and it's large enough to cover a family of 4 for up to 4 years.
A family of 4?
You know, So get thee to Nothing But Nets.
Because there was a lot
of the great Harold Pollack, a University of Chicago health economist, posted on it this week in the Huffington Post. We'll put a link to that as well.
All right. No, I mean, again, this is something that I thought you would say it, but I'll say this is something that, of course, the UN is perfectly positioned to, declare war on a scourge-like disease. There were a few, there were just to a report from the field. Today we also had Margaret Chan of WHO, and one of my colleagues, a correspondent here, asked a question about reports that some of the bed nets were being used as both wedding veils and as fishing nets, which many people started laughing when they heard it, but Margaret Chan of WHO confirmed that has taken place and added that they now try to put a red X on some of the nets so that they're not put to other uses, But
interesting.
And also the number didn't, some of the reporters here were given a press release last night, sort of in advance of Ban Ki-moon's speech, saying that declaring an end to malaria by 2010. And I think if you search the wires, you'll see some stories that say UN, will end malaria by 2010. And then they were told, no, it was a badly written press release. What it means is full coverage with nets, which is the number that you're citing. And they also, again, because it was numbers, it was said that there's 250 million bed nets needed, and that this would cover 600 million people. So they may be big enough for a family of 4, but they seem to be counting on about 2.1 person per net.
Yeah, well, it would seem to make sense.
It makes sense.
You say sort of the reasons they say nets are so effective is because malaria tends to infect children, so the number one killer of children under 5 in sub-Saharan Africa. And mosquitoes feed at night when families are sleeping, so hence the bed net. But part of that $10 it says on the Nothing But Net website goes to sort of education as well. So perhaps they wouldn't turn their bed nets into fishing nets.
One thing, and this was kind of it's not only difficult but senseless to be a naysayer on an anti-malaria campaign. There was a pretty well reasoned article in The Economist. So since we're trading links, we should link to this one as well. That sounds a cautionary note about previous attempts to wipe out malaria, where money is spent in a frenzy in the upfront and almost wipes out the disease, but doesn't quite accomplish it. But by then, young people no longer develop immunity, and then it comes back with a vengeance. And the example they give is Sri Lanka. And in fact, this guy, Ray Chambers, who's the envoy of it, was quoted in it as saying, we have to be careful not to have another Sri Lanka. So I think there is I think The Economist, which is, by no means a naysaying publication, said it's important that there be as much focus on they call it the last mile or the last fence. Yeah. Right now, though, this is definitely, this week, I have to say, in terms of either, whether it's PR or fundraising, Margaret Chan was in D.C., she met with Bush has made a commitment. Gordon Brown was on American Idol talking about bed nets. We had Jeffrey Sachs at the front of the room here today, so everyone's on board. But I think, this idea that sort of like it's important. There's not even on the horizon. There's not a vaccine. This is not an attempt to end malaria. It's an attempt to sort of control it.
Control and combat it.
So that's all.
Actually, relatedly, so something I've heard recently is that climate change, shockingly, is climates are getting warmer, and mosquitoes, the vectors, are sort of traveling to places and to climates they used to not be. Mm-hmm. So malaria is starting to show up in more and more places where it once was thought to have been effectively wiped out. Mm-hmm. I don't know if this was any sort of part of UN discussion this week.
That didn't know nobody, but I'm actually surprised because these are definitely like massively the buzzwords here. There was in preparing for today's Margaret Chan thing, they jumped on board and said that climate change is also a health problem, which I think people knew. I know that one. Yeah. I mean, I want to actually say one. It may seem rare to you, but we had a briefing yesterday by the head of the World Food Program, Josette Schierenshiner. And she was very well, versed, and obviously the topic was this issue of rising food prices and riots in 30-some countries, and so it's essentially it's a pitch for sort of emergency funds, but and there's been a sort of, it's come a little bit late, but the UN is definitely trying to be, it's convening a food summit, and all the agencies are meeting. One issue that came up in her, there's a sort of a trading of the causes of, like, is the devotion of land to biofuels the cause, or an issue that came up yesterday is whether the degree to which increased speculation and sort of hedge funds having gotten involved in a lot of the trading of futures has played a role, and that's something where she wouldn't really say. She said she thinks it's a part of it, but their focus is just the immediate emergency. But there was there was actually an article in Grist this week, the environmental news blog that sort of listed speculation as sort of of the panoply of causes of the sort of rapid increase in food prices. Speculation was sort of listed among them by this sort of food and agriculture reporter. No, absolutely. And there's a kind of and again, in trying to bone up for it, there's a pretty. I think that you're going to see more of this. Whether I think skeptics might say, it's always you're going to blame the rich for the problems of the poor. But yeah, I think so. Mm-hmm. And there's a particularly interesting fund called Osprey, spelled the Dwight Anderson is the founder, and it has money from like CS First Boston and J.P. Morgan Chase, and they made these massive bets that food prices would rise. And up till like a year ago, they were very proud of it. They were being interviewed by the financial press as sort of like the whiz kids of starvation, and then they suddenly realized how sick it looks. And reportedly, the founder of this hedge fund has bought up the rights to every photograph of him, in order to not become, like, I guess, persona non grata or seized up in these countries. So it's a kind of, I found one and put it in an article about it, because I figure if you're going to make billions of dollars off famine, you should probably have your photograph somewhere on the internet. But yikes! I mean, speaking of $1 billion in famine, so the World Food Program, right? Mm-hmm. It's funded by member country donations, principally. And they put out an appeal sort of at the beginning of the year for sort of $2.9 billion, projecting that is what they would need to feed like the some 73 million people they feed every day. And sort of shortly after they released that, they had to sort of modify that and increase it by another $500 million, and that was in March. Yep. And then just last week, they sort of issued a press release again saying that because just over the last month, food prices have increased so much that they are now asking for an additional $750 million above their initial $2.9 billion appeal. Yeah, no. And and so far, they've only raised something like $900 million. So, it does not bode well, I think. Right. No, I bet. They're beating the drum, and it's sort of. I mean, we usually are on only talking about war or UN corruption. These are all. Yeah, the good. No, these are very good. No, they're very good topics. I think one thing that came up is sort of as something of a not of a conflict. The WFP has historically been subject to the critique that basically they took U.S. Commodities, surplus commodities, and paid huge transportation fees to bring them to Africa in such a way that it actually harmed African agriculture. And it was more expensive, right? Oh, totally. But that was, in a way, you could blame the U.S. for only wanting to give in kind instead of cash. Ms. Sheeran said, that now over 50% of WFP's budget is cash, which is good because then they can buy the food where they want, and they would like to buy it in the developing world. And she gave the example of like they buy some commodity, I'm not sure what, in the far reaches of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And frankly, it didn't sound like it's necessarily makes sense as a purely economic thing, but it's kind of their contribution to rebuilding a war-torn area. But she's actually, the problem that they have is that they also don't want to buy in markets that already face shortages. See what I mean? So it's like on the one hand they want to buy food in the developing world because that would help develop the market. At the same time, if they become a purchaser in these markets, it just raises the prices there.
Yeah, I could see
And
it.
actually, some of the countries they want to buy from are now imposing the export, bans on, i.e., they won't sell rice outside. So it's sort of, again, I always like an issue more where I can sort of be like, there's the point. This is kind of it's a complicated issue where there's sort of, you have these two competing, policy goals, which is like buying in the developing world, but not buying in the developing world, so you just drive up prices more. So it's sort of, I think it's kind of an interesting one to see how, and again, it's one of these things where I think it's that's where like you don't want to. Everyone wants to say let's take it for granted that the anti-malaria and WFP all want to do the right thing, but there definitely is a place because of often unintended consequences and stuff. For more scrutiny is better, and it seemed I will to her credit, this Joseph Shear in China held along. She took all questions. It was kind of a model that other UN agencies could learn from in terms of like if you're going to raise money, take questions and
I think she had a great quote. I don't know if it was from that news conference, but it was certainly or from a recent one where she's calling the food crisis or the silent tsunami.
That was that's she repeated it. I think she'd said it before, but yep.
Yeah, and I think that sort of put it very well. But actually, I don't know how silent it is though, because we are paying attention to it.
When people riot,
that's at least something.
At the UN, the warning bell was the riots in Haiti, where people started shooting at the UN headquarters, and the UN headquarters started shooting back, and then the Prime Minister had to resign. That's a very serious. It's actually maybe this. I don't know if this is the transition. This may be a little bit dry, but what's weird is that so this is obviously this is kind of it's even a more graphic topic than climate change because you actually have people like rioting in the streets, and it's sort of the price of rice has tripled. So there's this move afoot. Maybe the UN Security Council should, as it tends to do, take up this hot topic. And what's actually kind of interesting is that the developing world countries, or at least Indonesia, I could say this, and I think it's probably true also of like South Africa, and maybe even of China, they don't like it when the Security Council grabs every issue they can. So they were saying that we had the Indonesian ambassador said it's an important issue, but it's not necessarily one of international peace and security unless it affects a UN peacekeeping. It did come up in the Council about Haiti because it had to, because the peacekeepers were getting shot at by people who can't afford food.
So you're saying that Indonesia and South Africa, which are on the Security Council, didn't want the Council to take up this issue?
Correct, they don't, because that's what it may be a little too inside, not too inside baseball. A lot of the struggles that the UN have to do with the Security Council, which is dominated by the U.S., U.K., France, Russia, and China, wants to grab every issue. And you have the other countries that don't really get to play on the Security Council saying, no, something has to be left for the General Assembly. Otherwise, what's its function, Otherwise, let five countries run the world. And so they're in a weird position that even issues they care about, trying to keep those issues off the Security Council's agenda.
What could the General Assembly do that the Security Council couldn't?
No, it's not that they could accomplish anything, and it's also unclear. I mean, the Security Council can tell people it can authorize the use of military force, and it can tell people that they have to impose financial sanctions on people. I'm not convinced that the Security Council can feed anyone. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's not. I don't think their fight is not that the GA can do better. It's that the GA is a more democratic. Every country is represented on it. And the U.S. doesn't have a veto, That's kind of the thing.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of gets to that underlying tension that I think that we talk about a lot, which is, the developing world sort of pushing back against, what they see as sort of the ship being tightly controlled by too small a number of countries.
Correct. No, absolutely. That was sort of using it as,
I guess maybe this is a transition, but speaking of the Security Council...
Sure.
funny thing happened on the way to the Security Council.
Yeah, some ambassadors.
Libya, right?
Yeah, some ambassadors walked out, and
yes.
now everyone's competing to say who walked out first. The trigger of the walkout was I think.
Let's take a step back and walk us through.
I'm going to walk you through the walkout. We're going to walk in,
yes.
and then we're going to walk out. There was a among various topics discussed in the Security Council this week was the
yes.
situation in it was called the situation in the Middle East, but most of it had to do
yes.
with the Gaza Strip and the ongoing
yes.
blockade and
yes.
the UN basically saying they're going to stop delivering food because they have no gas, and the power plant almost being cut off. And to be fair, on the other side, what Israel says is as long as missiles keeps being fired at it, they feel that this is a fair response. And also to be fair, some of the fuel problems are caused by the missile firing, i.e., some of the missiles are fired at border crossings, and so I guess on the Gaza Strip side, people might say the whole thing was triggered by this embargo of the sort of like almost blockade. So in any case,
yeah, well, it is a fuel blockade, is it not?
It is, and although they let it in, and there are some stories that the fuel is right across the border, but even some gas station attendants in the Gaza Strip are unwilling to pick it up because it's too dangerous. So it's quite a bad situation. And out in the real world, Hamas has offered a ceasefire of rockets if there's an end to military operations and an end of the blockade, but apparently that's not being taken up. But here was the walkout. There was because of the splits on the Security Council, i.e., the countries that are more on the side of the people in the Gaza Strip want to issue a statement that condemns the blockade as collective punishment and as a crime against humanity, essentially, right? And then you have the other people that are more attuned to either they would say the roots of the problem or Israel's position want such a statement to very much condemn the rocket firing and actually to call it terrorist. On the other hand, the people more attuned to the Gaza Strip say terrorism has never even been defined at the UN. How can you use the word? But what it all came down to, all of these are legitimate debates and differences of opinion, were thrown on the ground and set on fire by a comment by the deputy ambassador of Libya in a late afternoon session on the Gaza situation. Said that the situation in Gaza is similar to that in the concentration camps in World War II. And what happened is we were all this was a closed consultation, so there's no footage of this, but the reporters were all hanging around outside the Security Council waiting for them to come out and say that nothing was accomplished. But in fact, they ran out, and we were given by each of the press spokesmen of the different countries a different explanation, i.e., the press spokesman of France said that his ambassador threw down his earpiece and ran out in protest as soon as he heard the analogy. And then the U.S. deputy ambassador made a point of coming to the stakeout the next morning to say he had been outraged, and they're now saying that they were the first to leave. And then, I don't mean to make light of it, but because it was such, and even some countries, I've spoken to diplomats from countries that are more attuned with the Gaza Strip side, let's put it that way, that think that the comment was, outrageous and out of place. Although Syria has defended it on camera and said, yes, we make that analogy, and off camera, the Libyan deputy has actually said that the Gaza Strip is worse than the concentration camps. That's what he said. Many things he says in Arabic, and so some of us reporters don't understand it, but that he said in English. So
one would presume if you look at if you look at the outcome of what followed from this inflammatory comment, it would seem that Libya did not succeed in sort of getting their way. So it seems to have backfired, certainly.
Exactly. I don't know. I haven't almost figured out sort of what. I think that there was almost no chance of the statement being passed anyway. It may have just been in a fit of peace. I don't think it was unplanned. And the fact that Syria's backed it up, it's not like this was, believe it or not, that this was sort of like totally out of the blue. But it seems like a lot of diplomats feel it was just, like one guy said to me, like, this is like from the street. It has no place in here, that kind of statement. But here's again, with an eye for the absurd. The funniest one was this, is that there was a report in I don't know, I hope I'm going to pronounce it right, Corriere della Sera, the big Italian newspaper.
The Italian paper,
The Italian paper ends up reporting on all this, that Rome puts a stop to the UN in defense of, because of the concentration camp analogy. And as it turns, so I heard this and I looked into it, and what it turns out is that the Italian wire service, their main guy wasn't here. It was a late afternoon. And so when the meeting broke up in this way, the wire service central in Midtown Manhattan called the Italian mission spokesman and said, what happened? And the Italian mission spokesman sort of made his ambassador look good and said, no, my ambassador, whose name is Marcello Spatafora, he told the president of the council that if it got out of hand, he would make a signal and to suspend the meeting, and that's what happened. And so this got sent in Italian as an urgent wire service story, saying, the Italian ambassador brings an end to a Security Council meeting, and it ended up on the front page of this newspaper. So the next day, I asked the president of the council, Kamalo of South Africa, what about this? What about this story that the Italian ambassador made the gesture and led to the close of the meeting? And he said, that's the first I hear about it. So it's sort of and then you go back to all the other countries scrambling for who was the one that and again I don't mean to, it's sort of there is I guess it's like the presidential campaign here. It's like there's a lot of outrage, and sometimes you ask yourself when people are too fast to publicize their outrage, you know what I mean? It sort of becomes a competition in publicizing your outrage rather than actual outrage. But
yes,
it's an outrageous comment.
And meanwhile, nothing got accomplished.
Right.
The blockade exists today, so the UN so they have to cut food shipment. Right. So today, Friday, a day after the walkout, or 2 days after the walkout, the UN announced that they sort of had to suspend a lot of their humanitarian work, and water and sewage are getting shut off, and so Gaza plunges deeper, I think, into humanitarian crisis.
Yep. No, and it really is. But I mean, again, to not make it's an outrageous comment, but it is one thing. And I'll just say, the Syrian ambassador, who today is actually having to rebut these more recent charges of North Korean assistance to an alleged nuclear facility that was blown up by Israel 7 months ago or whatever. What he was saying is, and this actually that in a way that it's not just the Security Council, the UN itself, you have these meetings constantly on, they call it, euphemistically, the situation in the Middle East. But right these days it's about Gaza. And it really involves the UN producing a report, basically a scorecard. In this most recent one, it's 69 Palestinians killed, 6 Israelis. A recounting of, using with the word terrorism, attacks, rocket attacks on border crossings. And no real kind of suggestion of any kind. And there's the understanding that because of the veto, there's not, from the perspective of countries like Syria, it's never going to be solved by the Security Council because of kind of a veto deadlock. Even during the war that's now almost 2 years ago, or going on 2 years ago, of Israel and South Lebanon, many countries, it seemed like a majority of countries on the Security Council wanted to pass a resolution asking for a cessation of the incursion, but the U.S. vetoed that. So there is, I guess I'm saying it's kind of, I think Libya, they don't have a veto, but they now have taken, they're the polar opposite of the U.S. They won't even admit there's anything wrong with the rocket fire. They think it's a legitimate form of self-defense, and so it goes.
I guess I think we've talked about this before, but what's shocking to me, maybe when I heard Libya was going to be on the Security Council, I thought, okay, this is sort of a new morning in Tripoli, right? That sort of Libya is coming out from the international cold and is going to sort of be a more constructive player on the international scene, and there are a few hopeful signs that might be the case for Darfur. They hosted a meeting there that was meant to sort of provide space for Darfur rebels and the government to come together to talk, and it looked like that they were going to be a bit more helpful. From your, I guess, angle, has that been the case?
It really hasn't, and it's kind of I don't know if it's helpful. I think the one to again, I don't know why I want to be fair, but they're not. Their position on the council is not only for themselves, in the sense that they have meetings with the Arab group, with the OIC, and so some of I don't think that this you can't attribute this comparison to all the other countries, but their position in the council, it's sort of, although it's always a non-permanent member, but before it was Qatar, and before that, there basically is always a kind of an Arab country on the council, and they're kind of acting for the group. Although they have no power to veto resolutions, but they can stop, like, the day-to-day work of the council is like this issuance of, like, press statements and presidential statements.
Yeah.
And there, if any country doesn't agree, nothing comes out. And so they do that. I also, but on the flip side, even the thing that you tried to give them credit for, there are people that would say that their mediation efforts in Chad and Sudan is because they're a player in some of these conflicts. You know what I mean? It's not as sort of selfless and statesman-like. And when go ahead.
What my understanding was that they held certain influence and sway over a number of the rebel groups, particularly the rebel groups that were holding out from joining a peace talk. So it was hoped that they could exert their influence and get the rebel groups to sort of enter peace agreements.
No, they definitely hosted the talk. I think what people found, it was called the CERT talk, and many people, although not many of the top rebels didn't go, but many people went. But the irony was what people were, and Ban Ki-moon had praised Muammar Gaddafi for sponsoring it, and then all the people got there for the conference, and Gaddafi gave an opening speech, and he said, "This is ridiculous. The international community is just trying to take advantage of Africa. Look at this." So he kind of he invited everyone there, and then he kind of pissed all over them, and not much came out of it. And actually, just on the kind of the scuttlebutt here is there's been this effort on the political front to have Jan Eliasson of the previous head of the General Assembly has been part of a negotiating team. That the idea is that he's getting tired and it hasn't been accomplished, and that they're going to try to find a new negotiator by June. So a lot of people are trying to track down who's that person going to be and what are the names.
That's the inside line, though. So I mean, just to give a bit of background. He is known as being like a very skilled diplomat. Oversaw the contentious 2005 UN reform effort. And is he like a former prime minister of Sweden?
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah, and top, everyone likes him, and says, but and so he was tapped to be the sort of envoy to Sudan, but apparently he's getting frustrated at each point by lack of progress. So that's interesting. I did not know that they were looking to.
It's reached the point.
Breaking news here on.
No, there you go. That's what. No. It's pretty well known that's the and so the actual idea is like, what's the name? And obviously it has to be it's going to be run by the AU. It's probably going to be an African name. They'd like to get somebody high profile, but to many people it seems like something of a thankless task.
Yeah. So we're the 5-year anniversary of Darfur. It would seem that I don't think the odds are in this mediator's favor. Right. So Matthew, what's your favorite Olympic event?
Oh,
yeah.
Well, they're
changing.
Oh, actually, here's I'm just trying to things that that happen here that you may not otherwise see in print. Is FYI. Oh, on the Olympics. First of all, there was
the hint.
Oh, thanks so much. No, I went somewhere else with it, where you'll see. But I guess obviously, everyone has seen this footage of the progress of the torch around the world and attempts to blow out the torch, and a kind of just a really public relations, at a minimum, disaster for China, the timing of the crackdown in Tibet and all this.
But the Chinese people would not know it was a public relations disaster because these images are being censored for them. But go on.
Okay, I'm sorry. This is as a placeholder. Let me tell you that from their perspective, from the Chinese perspective, God forgive me for articulating it. But they also there's a website that is, I'm sure people are free to call propaganda, but it's anti-CNN.com. It's very much sponsored by the Chinese government, and what they try to do in their own inimitable way is to critique Western media's presentation of Tibet and show, and a couple times they've actually made some good points where they've shown here's a wider camera angle. In the same way that people kind of discredited the U.S. version of pulling down the statue in Baghdad, there is a position in China which is that their position. Their position is that not. When they say the Dalai Lama is a rioter, it seems kind of absurd. But that there was what could even be classified as almost ethnically based violence directed at Han Chinese in Tibet, and they have some footage to that effect that doesn't get a lot of play in Western media. Whatever. Maybe I'm just being the devil's advocate, literally in saying this. But here's the point I wanted to make. It's easy. We say in China they don't get to say the real thing. I've discovered in the course of this that within the UN building, on UN servers, you cannot see anti-CNN.com. It is blocked. That in fact, I'm not kidding you. That within and this is not that in fact the UN itself filters the internet, and although they claim that the filtering is only to block pornography, gambling, anonymizer and spam websites, they end up blocking even a site that's called globalcompactcritics.net, whose only function is to compile articles critical of the UN Global Compact. And in fact, they can't see it.
Tell us what is the.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Global
You're
Compact?
right. The Global Compact was an initiative set up under Kofi Annan to harness the goodwill and the power of the private sector to work for the ideals of the United Nations: human rights, labor rights, environmental, and anti-corruption. And so.
Well, who can be against that?
Well, no, please, because most people see it as a kind of a blue washing, where you have corporations that manufacture weapons and tobacco all joining it and getting feted with canapes. I know you don't like that word, canapes at the UN, and it is. There's a real lack of standards. Like, I think what the critics would say is that it'd be fine to have that if you had to actually do something for human rights to join the club. But if they let anyone join the club, then it's a meaningless club, and it allows these companies to use their membership like a club against their critics. So that's the critique. But I know people that work for the UN that wish they could see the site, because to do their job, they need to know what their critics are saying. And so it seems ironic. And then this is a long tangent, but having discovered this and written a story about internet censorship by the UN, I approached one of the Chinese diplomats. Because naive as I am, I thought like they would be outraged, and it would be a very funny story to have China attacking the UN for internet censorship. Sure. It seemed like a no-brainer, right? So I approach them, and they say, "Oh my gosh," and they look into it, and they find it to be true, and they come back to me, and they say, "We're not going to complain about it, but they should stop complaining about us." See what I mean? So that's why I really felt like an idiot, because it's a funny quote, so that's fine for a story, but I thought it's not a question of like. It's just, there's journalism, but in the course of journalism, it's like, right, it's like a bee and flowers. You go to one side, you hear one thing, you go to the other side. You don't try to make a fight, but in this one, it seemed like this will be really funny to have China. I mean, I think, and I don't know. I'm going to have this tangent. I want to ask you, what do you think of the UN itself blocking websites?
Well, I guess when it comes to porn or whatever, that's probably a good idea to block that. But I would hope that they wouldn't block many other types of websites.
And do you think once it's raised, what they've said is their defense has been, we've outsourced our censorship. They've hired an outside firm to filter the internet for these reasons, and they don't think it's important to have some way to say, oops. It probably looks bad to have the UN blocking, like, anti-UN.org. You know what I mean? Whether you and I like the site or not, it seems like you probably should be able to read it, No,
I agree. And to be clear, is this sort of just any computer within the building?
It's what it is. It's the UN. It's for example, the people that I know that want to read globalcompactcritic.net, and I have no relation with the site. I'm not promoting them, but since they're blocked, I want to keep naming them. I'll say it again. Globalcompactcritics.net. That they bring in their own laptop to read it. No UN computer can see it. And I've actually written. I'll post a link to the story. I downloaded the screenshot that says this website is blocked. And it seems all, So I just think it may seem like a strange sidelight, but it seems. I guess I'd say this. There's a kind of a form of arrogance where it seems to me. I mean, I was going to say if I were the UN, that's the wrong way to phrase it, but I think given the high ideals of the organization, when something like this comes to light, they just have to say it's not falling on their sword. Like, okay, we can fix this. Instead, they reflexively say, well, any other company does it. And it's true. Maybe a company blocks pornography and by mistake ends up blocking, like, I've heard people say that they can't visit the Center for Disease Control because it's viewed as a pornographic site, because it mentions the names of body parts, right? I mean, not body parts, you know what I mean. Whatever. Yeah. But it's one thing for Coca-Cola is doing censorship. It's a private company. But I think in the same way that we hold government institutions in the U.S. to being like, First Amendment.
Well, for what it's worth, I mean, U.S. government institutions routinely block websites. Like, my buddies that work at, at sort of the executive office of the president, the big office. I mean, they can't look up UN Dispatch. They can't look up
WhiteHouse.com.
Political websites. I'm sorry.
No, nothing. WhiteHouse.com. Do you know about that one?
The spoof site?
I don't know if it's a spoof. I actually think it's a porn site. I think some porn they managed to buy that one. Only in America. I think, and they haven't gotten the UN's internet organization to take them down as internet pirates, for having taken. We can talk pirates, but the whole thing was a tangent. I want to put myself back in your trusty hands to get us back on track.
Back to my question. So what's your Olympic event?
Oh, right. I was going to, torch, blowing out the torch.
Relay?
Blowing out the torch.
Blowing out the torch?
Yeah, no, and this is not a tangent. Now we're back on track. So during all those protests of the torch, right? Various leaders, let's focus on the European leaders, tried to kind of have it both ways. They said, maybe we're not going to go to the opening ceremony, because of Tibet. And I think, for example, in France, I covered pretty closely. The human rights minister of France, who was here recently, said, unless China meets these three conditions, an end to violence in Tibet, etc., Sarkozy will not go to the opening. And then Sarkozy kind of took back from that, but said, we're very concerned. I think the idea is that, and Gordon Brown has said the same, like Gordon Brown wouldn't touch the torch when it came to 10 Downing Street. This is all, so it's sort of like, it's kind of like they want to have it both ways. No one has come outright and said, we're boycotting, but they've wanted to kind of imply maybe they won't go. And there's pressure now on President Bush to not go, and he says he's going. Believe it or not, Ban Ki-moon, of whom very few would have expected this, and actually here I'm going to do some horn blowing. I was told one day it'd be interesting to ask if he's going to go, because it was the person who told me this, understanding that he wasn't going to go, and that China was very mad about it. So I went to a noon briefing, and I said, and literally nothing had been said here. I go to a noon briefing, and I just said, has he been invited, and if so, what's his response? And the spokeswoman said, we have nothing to announce on that today. And I thought that they would just blow it off until August. The next day they come in, and the spokeswoman says, in response to a question asked yesterday, we can say that Ban Ki-moon, several months ago, informed the Chinese that he may not be able to attend this important event due to scheduling issues. And there was a vast silence, and then everyone started saying, what issue could it be? Where is he going to be on August 8th? What's going on? And the spokeswoman was like, I've said all I have. That's all I have. And then people started asking, like, well, when did he get invited? Because the real scuttlebutt here is, there's a lot of scuttlebutt, but China obviously doesn't like this, right? Yes. And it actually got reported all over the world. Not maybe because this is another reflection of like the lack of kind of high media profile of Ban Ki-moon, but it got sort of as a squib in otherwise Olympic-focused articles. Even Ban Ki-moon is not going, implying that human rights in China are so bad that even Ban Ki-moon, not necessarily thought of as pro-human rights as Kofi Annan, is not going. The reality is I mean, I don't know. I can't. I'm not inside his mind.
So have they not come out with what else is he doing that day?
It's not that he. I think it's their position that it's not that he has anything else to do that day. It's that because he's a substantive person, he prefers a substantive visit, and he is going in July to the G8 meeting in Japan, and at that time, as part of that visit, he wants to visit Seoul, South Korea, and also Beijing. Yeah. And so, because he's takes China so seriously, he doesn't want to just go to the Olympics and be one official among others. He wants to go in July and give them the full 4-day treatment which he recently gave Russia. And
clever.
It actually may be the reasoning. I'm not kidding you. That they may actually have thought that this made sense. The thing is, it no longer makes sense if you're Ban Ki-moon, and here's why. The scuttlebutt is that not only Russia has denied it, but with half of a wink, that because of his statements and inaction during from the perspective of Russia, breakaway of Kosovo, they may not support him for a second term. This was reported. That's all I can say. The Times of London reported it, quoting Russian sources. There are other people saying,
Russia, but would he not be jeopardized? I mean, could not China and Russia together sort of band together to not support him?
Oh, it only takes one, actually. But they would look better if it was two of them. Yeah.
I mean, is he going to be sort of, as they say in Canada, cheesing off the Chinese by not going, sort of to the extent that they might not permit him to run for a second 5-year term?
It wouldn't be for that reason alone, but it would be part of a pattern. And actually, when this first happened, I was pretty confident that he'll end up crumbling and going. To be quite honest. Now I don't know, because he's kind of dug. I think with China, and here's a total irony. because I tried to get a quote from the Chinese mission about him not going. I thought that would be a good quote to get, right?
Yeah.
And they were like, well, it's our understanding that it's just a scheduling thing. You should really ask him that, like kind of like encouraging that he be asked on camera, sort of like he's queued up to now say the right thing. See what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
As it turns out, the next day there was a story on Xinhua quoting him. Like Ban Ki-moon sat down with the Chinese state media and said, the only reason I'm not going, it has nothing to do with human rights. The thing is, I think there's still a wait-and-see attitude on China's part. If it keeps being reported that he's not going for human rights reasons, then he's going to have to go. He's tried to clarify it, but because
I see what you're saying.
Because leaders that are actually doing it for, if not human rights, at least local domestic political reasons, are saying it's scheduling, right? I think Sarkozy and Brown, they haven't said, I because of the Dalai Lama. They've said, I'm so busy I can't go. But it's wink, wink. He's trying to say, I'm really busy. Or I really am conflicted.
But that's actually I think that's a really interesting point. So once he says, so if it were ever to come out that he's not going to go for human rights reasons, then he would have to go.
Yeah, if it's reported that way, even if it's not true, and I don't think it is true. I mean, not to be, but
he's a busy
guy. But it's
guy.
classic. I mean, again, not to be. I actually, and again, and I don't just say this as a caveat. He from everything that I've seen, and I've spoken with him, he's a very pleasant guy. He's really a nice person. But this is a classic screw up. Again, it's the worst of both worlds.
Well, how is it a screw up though? It seems to be he's playing it pretty well.
Well, I guess maybe in some alternative universe.
If you take from the starting point that he just really doesn't want to go,
right?
He seems to be playing it pretty well, right?
I guess it's that he really they didn't foresee. They got very tested. I'll say this: I don't think they foresaw that not going would be viewed as a human rights statement. But that was obvious. It was freaking obvious. You see what I mean? And so they act like the media totally misrepresented. But when all the other leaders are saying they might not go because of Tibet, and then you say, I'm not going. Honestly, in this case, I was surprised that the next day, I'm usually very outraged when they don't answer questions.
Yeah.
But this is a question they didn't need to answer at this time. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But for some reason they did.
Here's a fun question. What do you think the odds are that he will end up going to the
I know.
opening ceremonies?
I have to say those are changing daily. I would have put it at like 80%. Despite the denial, he's going to have to go. I think it also depends on events on the ground. If there's it's almost funny. I almost think there's a reverse correlation. The more real world, the more other world leaders don't go, the more likely it is that China will say you have to come.
Go.
See what I mean?
Right. But, at least Bush is going to go. Yeah, maybe Gordon Brown or I bet Sarkozy goes.
I think where you're going to end up, you may have some that skip the opening ceremony, but then go with great fanfare day two and stay, whoop it up. And
watch the long jump.
Oh, you know what? I want to give some props to a UN official. Are you ready?
Okay. Well,
he is. You may never have heard of him before, but he's the number 2. He's the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees. His name is Craig Johnstone. He is an American. He said, I interviewed him this week because he was angry at a story I'd written, and so he offered to. He was here, and he said, "Let's sit down." He said, to be perfectly frank, I don't agree that any jobs in the UN system should be reserved for particular nationalities, but my post has historically been an American post. And he said, this is what I'm giving him props for. I didn't think he would answer it. I asked him, is it true, as people report, that China is putting pressure on UNHCR to not have refugees in and around Beijing at the time of the Olympics and to not be in any way welcoming of North Korean refugees generally? And he said, yes, we are under that pressure.
Oh,
and I was like,
very frank.
Are you sure? We're on the record? He's like, we're on the record. He said, and again, he said, we've been under that pressure before the Olympics. It's not only the Olympics, and he said, and again, he said, to be quite frank, I have to think that China is now wishing it hadn't said yes to the Olympics, which I don't think is right, actually. But I think for a UN official to speak his mind about China's behavior before the Olympics is very rare.
Yeah.
Very rare.
Interesting. Yeah.
So I think
that's
truth. Speaking truth, I guess you can do that when you're an American official in a historically U.S. controlled post in the UN system. You know?
There you go.
Anyway, so
see that this is part of my argument for greater U.S. control over the UN.
Is it? I know that's your drive. I know. Here we go, and I indulged your humanitarian impulses. So please indulge my eye on the absurd and corruption. But there was an event. An event has taken place, and it involves women's rights. And the event is as follows: UNIFEM, the UN's women's organization, has been without a director for some months. The previous director is a woman from Singapore, and she was named to head the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. That's not important, though. She's important, and so is ESCAP. But what's important here is many NGOs, and I don't know how plugged in you are in the world of women's NGOs, but it's an extensive world. They thought it was very important that somebody be appointed. And they had a very close watch on the whole process, where there was a short list, there were 4 or 5 candidates, they were interviewed, and actually they know that there was a winner of the process. Interviews were done, and the recommendation of the winner of the short list was a woman from India named Geeta Sen, S-E-N. And they thought she was going to be announced, and then at the last moment, pressure was brought to bear, and an announcement was made that a woman named Ines Alberti, a sociologist from Spain, was being named the new head of UNIFEM. And that day, the NGOs issued press releases saying it's an outrage, it's a disrespect, not just to Ms. Sen, but to the whole process, to women in general. And what they tied this to was Spain gave $700 million to the UN Development Program about a year and a half ago, and has also recently made a $4 million contribution to a much smaller UN trust fund for violence against women run by UNIFEM. And so, based on these NGO press releases, I called the Spanish mission that day and said, what do you say to the critique that Ms. They hadn't confirmed it. First, could you confirm she's getting the job? And they were like, yes. And then, what do you say to the critique that money talks in this instance? And they said, well, you can't really say that, because there have been some days where, there have been some years we give a lot of money and we got nothing. So, yes, we should get something. And it pretty much is not disputed that Spain's financial contribution was the determining factor in the award of this post. And the ultimate irony is 18 minutes after announcing that the woman from Spain got the UNIFEM post over the woman from India, UNDP issued a second press release. This is all like past 6 p.m. saying that, but the head of their Asia Bureau is being given to a guy from India. And an argument has been made to me by UN officials, but what do you mean? What's their beef? India got something. But the Indian ambassador says, Indians are not interchangeable. And not only did the right Indian not get the job, but the Indian, and I know this is his words, the Indian given the UNDP job already worked in the international system, worked for the World Bank or something. So it wasn't, from his perspective, it wasn't like a person from India coming to work for the UN. It was kind of like a pre-existing Indian already in the system being given a slightly higher post. And so there's actually quite a bit of, it's interesting because it's not clear. These NGOs continue to send out material and evidence of the short list, and it's not going to be undone. But it's created a situation in which Ms. Alberti, for example, has yet to hold a press conference. She was in New York. She held a press conference only for media from Spain, and was asked at it, are you going to do one for the rest of the media? And she said, not at this time. Because it's...
Well, did you... I'm wondering, so Nicole Kidman was at the UN. I was wondering if you had a chance to ask her about this. I'm sure you did.
And you know what happened? And again, this, I'll admit, is getting way too self-referential. But I was going to ask it. She was there. I said, Miss Kidman, First, I'm trying to think. I asked some other question. I always try to, as a lead-in, softball, and then the hardball. And the moderator of the press conference, who was a fairly highly placed UN communications professional, said, no, Matthew, please, can we stick to the topic at hand? And I said, well, this is about UNIFEM, and it's a UNIFEM press conference, and she's a UNIFEM World, Goodwill Ambassador. And they had then I was going to say your friend, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the relation is. You can say as soon as this anecdote is finished. Tim Worth answered. He said, that's a very relevant question. And he said, and I'm not here as an apologist, but we're always trying to do better, and we want there to be a higher profile for women's issues at the UN, but it doesn't take place overnight, and thank you for your question. Mm-hmm. And I think...
Well, I guess you say, for the record, I've never met Senator Worth, so it's in person, but I do... So the UN Dispatch is sponsored by the UN Foundation, and Tim Worth is the president of the UN
I'm
Foundation.
sorry, I don't mean to be. I'm not trying to bust your chops,
the,
Mark. I'm just.
No. I'm just put that out
He's
there.
A very impressive. He was a very. No, I have to give him. I've seen him twice this week. I mean, at a press conference.
Yeah.
I don't socialize with these people, but they're. He's good. I mean, he's a good speaker.
Yeah.
He handled that one with aplomb. But the reality, I mean, in a way, my joke is like, I'm not an apologist, but here, let me apologize for. And I really wonder. I wish. I'll say this to you as a UN Foundation affiliated person. Is it possible
I'm
that
not a spokesman in any way?
I mean, I think
I gotta put that
somebody,
out there.
even the greatest fans and friends of the UN.
Yes.
What's the position on the naked award of posts for money, or let's even say like that peacekeeping must go to France? Is that good or not? I'm asking you.
Yeah, I mean,
is it good?
It probably is. I mean, in an ideal world, you want the most qualified person for every post, right? But in the real world, politics, get involved,
sure.
and politics, rears its head sometimes. And so, I guess the answer is it's going to happen. You want to sort of minimize the posts and sort of the instances in which it happens, but I think to the extent that the United Nations is just it's a collection of member states. Each member state has their own parochial interests at certain points, whether that be promoting someone's cousin or donating to a certain cause because they have vested interest in that cause. You have to sort of accept that it's going to be an imperfect institution because it's run by sort of imperfect humans who work for and are members of member states that have their own interests at times.
No. I'm telling you, Tim Worth is you're look, watch out behind you. Like, but well,
I'm a big fan.
No, absolutely. No. Yeah. I mean, like that was. But I think
yeah.
then I'll shift down. I'll shoot for a much lower issue, which is that even if that's all true, why then?
Yeah.
I mean, and again, I'm very why does the UN? It's a legitimate question. You can't block the question. In essence, I mean, just on this one small thing that I'm telling you about, they try to not answer it. When it's like, to me, that's Bush League. It's Bush League. If that's what's going on, then you just answer the question and you move on and you say, hey, there are a lot of factors we look at. We hope that we have nothing but respect for Miss Sen. Who knows if she'll reappear in some other format? You know what I mean? There's a way, and I've seen people do it. Like you don't. I think I honestly do believe this. I think that there's a defensiveness. There's a kind of a willful defensiveness, and now I'm fully jumping on the soapbox because there's no accountability. Because there certainly can be no litigation. There's no real performance reviews. There's a way. Every organization is imperfect, but many of them can sort of fess up and say, you know what, we could have do this one better.
Let me maybe. I think maybe there's another reason for sort of the politics at play when sort of assigning and awarding positions or hiring. I can maybe draw on my own experience. I don't know if you know this, but I was an intern sort of right after college for a summer at the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague.
Sure, I know. I've seen. That's why your reports on that topic have been so well informed.
One thing I noticed when I was there that most of the prosecutors and most of the lawyers were either English, American, or Canadian. And it became apparent to me the reason they were either English, Canadian, or American is because the most skilled prosecutors in prosecuting these very complex crimes. Like there's programs in those countries that turn out these kind of prosecutors, and they were just sort of the best at what they do. But to avoid the appearance that Americans, Canadians, and Brits were prosecuting Serbs, they had to. There was, I think, an element of tokenism I noticed in bringing in people from other countries, even if those people were not as skilled lawyers or as skilled forensic osteopathologists as those from those three countries. It seems that you need to in order to avoid the appearance of a small group of countries ganging up or controlling the process, you need to have, a more broadly representative.
But in this case, no. I see. Here's the weird thing, and I'm sure I do have a double standard. But the problem here is that in this case, this is a case of a more qualified developing world candidate losing out to a less qualified first world candidate. See what I mean? It's not.
Yeah.
It's the worst of both worlds. I actually would say that you should have an affirmative. If you have a qualified candidate from northern Uganda, maybe you give them, because of their story and for various reasons, a leg up. But in this case, this was just money talks. And I think the one thing I want to, dispute with you is I think that there are places in the UN you can say it's kind of like a set-aside job or use the word tokenism, whatever it is. But the reality, and I've found this, and on a kind of a serious dollars and cents level, that the procurement done by UN peacekeeping, they call it systems contracts, meaning you buy a lot of stuff that's usable in any peacekeeping mission in the world, whether it's computers or food services or airfield services, is well over 70% developed world, and the U.S. is far and away the largest contractor, and to some degree it's because the headquarters is here. But it's not just the Lockheed Martin getting the Darfur contract. It's that India,
Russia is also.
In airfield services they're quite big. But I have the chart. I've written about this chart. But the killer is that, and there is a real sense. I think that people probably think that the UN it's so kind of like dominated by developing world. There's all this corruption and these unqualified. No. Where things really matter, and this would be, I would consider in that, like, who heads Department of Political Affairs, Department of Peacekeeping, Department of the first world totally rules the place. And where the dollars are, it almost strikes me as like it's almost greedy that you're not really talking about huge amounts of money, frankly. I sometimes say, $5 billion, it's a lot. But, in the scheme of things, I hate to say it, it's not huge. But even in the countries can't even, India, a country of 1 billion people, total sales to UN peacekeeping for systems contracts, $1.5 million in sandbags.
But India gives a lot of troops.
Definitely. No, I'm talking about procurement. I'm talking about things actually bought, and it's just kind of amazing. And actually, my sources on this are people that work there that are not really for any one nation. They honestly believe, there are many people that work here that believe that even down to the level of contracting, that the U.S., UK, and France. I think last time we spoke, I told you how France got a last-minute change to the Darfur peacekeeper camps contract to benefit their company. And it's something that a smaller country could never get. So it's sort of, I think that there's a lot of, I just wanted to say, because from the example you gave of like tokenism of having it not be, first world prosecutors, people might think that like the favoritism in the UN always runs to sort of less qualified but more diverse. And it's quite the opposite. In many, where money is on the line, it's almost entirely the opposite. Anyway, that's
precious resource. So we're just about out of time.
Nothing but soapbox. Okay, I guess we had the Pope, but if you want to diss him that way, that's up to you.
The
Pope was everywhere. No, you're right. The Pope was everywhere. There's no
the Pope kept me late a lot.
Yeah. Oh, right.
In 2 cities I visited this week, in Washington and New York, he had me behind schedule. But
I'm going to say, because I actually think we
on the cause of peace and justice.
Right. Oh, totally. No, and it was basically the UN almost shut down for a day. It was absolutely amazing. I do want. I'm sorry, Mark. I'm going to say, and this is to you. It can be. This is just a there's a committee at the UN called the Committee on the Relations with the Host Country. It meets every 3 months, and what it does is take complaints of countries that have been mistreated, they claim, by the host country, which is the United States, i.e. their delegates couldn't get a visa on time, or 3 months ago the issue was Cuba complained that the NYPD didn't sufficiently defend its embassy when rock throwers came. Right? So it's an interesting committee, and so I go. It's every 3 months. You go to it. It's never been a problem. This week, I went to it and was told, inner city press, you must leave. So I was like, well, this is strange. It's not listed as a closed meeting. It's in a big room. Most of the seats are empty. So I go back with media accreditation. They say, no, you must leave. Go back with the spokesman of the General Assembly president, who's always talks about transparency in the UN. Said this should be a no-brainer, right? Let him just. He goes in and says, I don't know. They're saying it's a closed meeting. You can't attend, but you should be comfortable because the UN's Department of Department of Public Information, DPI, is inside and will be issuing a press release about the meeting. So to make a long story,
so this was so is this committee? This committee is staffed by member states, right? It's not like a UN.
No, it's a committee. It's a
staffers.
committee of the General Assembly. Yeah. So, but it's staffed by UN staff from the Office of Legal Affairs, who in fact made this ruling. But here's to not go through all the fine points of whether it should. First of all, it seems strange that with the UN talking about transparency. I know that. I guess that's what it is. You're saying you would leap to the defense of the Secretariat if they were being accused of something wrong. But the GA, we can just say it's the countries. It's not the UN's fault. It's the countries, right?
Yeah.
But
that's.
But here, so let me zero in since just as that on the UN side, what does it mean for the UN's Department of Political? I keep making that mistake. The Department of Public Information to put out a press release about a meeting that's closed to the actual independent press, meaning. Can you believe the press release? Right? I'm sure online. Maybe nobody else reads them, but they produce this stuff and they say, "Here's what happened at the UN today." And at least until now, I've always thought, like, with maybe they shorten things for length, but they're not leaving out things that happened. But in fact, if the press, I was told the reason it's a closed meeting is that sensitive material is discussed, so you can't be inside. But don't worry, the UN's own press service is inside, so you'll know everything that happened. But if you're going to know everything that happened, then you can be inside. I mean, it's like this, number one. It's think of it as like the U.S. like the Sunshine Law, the Open Meetings Law. The presumption is all meetings are open, unless you have something truly confidential to discuss, and then you go into executive session and you have to justify it, right? But there's no way that you would say it's a closed session, but we'll have. Most governments don't have their own kind of like their own press department. Do you see what I mean? I don't. Maybe I'm not saying it right. I guess I'm wondering.
You feel wronged. I understand.
It's more than that.
You were kept out, but I know. I see what you're saying.
Okay, it may be mostly that. I don't think it is, though. I know. I think.
Yeah. I'm just wondering what they might have.
Well, discussed. I know that's the whole thing.
Well, this is the big.
That'll
be
for next time. You can remain where you either with your
stay tuned.
Your screen frozen or on the edge of your chair, but we'll get to the bottom of this.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew.
Sure, I know. I mean, forget it. You're when it's an honor. It's an honor to.
Hey, man, and anytime. Well, so we'll 2 weeks from now, let's talk
reconvene,
again.
and hopefully we'll have the answer to the host country committee.
There you go. We will know. All right. Well, signing off.
Okay,
Thanks
a lot.
Bye.